The December air bit sharp against my face as I stepped into the garage that morning, 3 days before Christmas. The overhead fluorescent buzzed and flickered before settling into its familiar hum, casting everything in that cold blue light that made even the warmest memories feel distant. I pulled my fleece jacket tighter and breathed in the familiar cocktail of scents that had defined this space for 37 years. Sawdust and WD-40, old coffee grounds, and something deeper. The ghost of her vanilla perfume that somehow still clung to the pegboard where her smaller tools hung. Martha's socket set was exactly where she'd left it 18 months ago, organized by size in the red metal case I'd given her for our 25th anniversary. She'd laughed when she unwrapped it, called me practical to a fault, then kissed my cheek and said that's exactly what she loved about me. The 916 socket was missing from its slot, probably still attached to something in the basement, some project she'd been tinkering with during those final weeks when the treatments weren't working anymore. I ran my thumb along the edge of the workbench, feeling the small dents and scratches we'd accumulated together. This had been our sanctuary, the place where we'd disappear on Sunday afternoons, while pot roast cooked itself tender in the oven. She'd work on her small repairs, cabinet hinges, loose drawer pulls, the perpetually wobbly leg on the kitchen stool, while I tackled larger projects. We'd work in comfortable silence, occasionally reaching around each other for tools, her hip bumping mine as we moved through the familiar dance of shared space. The radio crackled to life when I hit the power button, some Johnny Mathis Christmas song filtering through the static. I'd bought this radio at Montgomery Ward in 1987, back when Tommy was 12 and still believed in Santa Claus, still thought his old man knew everything worth knowing. The antenna was held in place with electrical tape now, but it still pulled in the AM station clearly enough. I pulled the drop cloth off my current project. A jewelry box made from cherry wood, my Christmas gift for Emma, Tommy's 8-year-old daughter. The wood had cost me more than I usually spent on such things, but cherry was Martha's favorite, and this was important. The box was nearly finished, just needed the final sanding and the application of 3 coats of Danish oil. The real work had been installing the hidden compartment in the base, a trick Martha had taught me years ago when she'd helped me build a hope chest for our daughter Sarah's 16th birthday. The compartment was lined with purple velvet, just big enough for the letter I'd placed there last night. Emma's letter, written in Martha's careful script during those final weeks. Martha had insisted on writing something for each grandchild, something they could open when they were old enough to understand. Emma's letter was simple, full of advice about being kind and curious, about remembering that love wasn't something you found, but something you chose to give, again and again. I picked up the 220 grit sandpaper and began working the lid in long, even strokes. The motion was meditative, automatic after all these years. Sand with the grain, never against it. Clean the dust between grits. Feel for imperfections with your fingertips, not just your eyes. Martha's voice echoed in my memory, patient and thorough, the way she'd been with everything. The garage door rumbled open behind me. I'd left it cracked for ventilation, and Mrs. Kowalski from next door poked her head in. She was bundled up in her red wool coat, the one she'd worn every winter for at least a decade. "Morning, Frank," she called, stepping just inside. "Working on Christmas presents again?" "Something like that," I said, not looking up from the jewelry box. "How are you holding up in this cold, Helen?" "Oh, you know, the arthritis doesn't appreciate the weather, but what's it gonna do, move to Florida without me?" She laughed at her own joke, then grew more serious. "I wanted to thank you again for fixing my storm door last week. Ralph used to handle those things, you know." I set down the sandpaper and looked at her properly. Helen Kowalski had been widowed 3 years now, and she still talked about Ralph in present tense sometimes, as if he'd just stepped out to the hardware store and would be back any minute. I understood the impulse. "Happy to help," I said. "That door just needed the screws tightened and a little graphite in the hinges. Ralph showed me the same trick on my basement door about 15 years ago." She smiled, the kind of sad, grateful smile that had become common currency in our neighborhood, as we all moved deeper into our 60s and 70s. He'd be pleased to know his knowledge is still helping folks. After she left, I returned to the jewelry box, but my mind wandered to the conversation I'd had with Tommy the night before. He'd called around 8, after Emma's bedtime, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant he was about to ask for something he wasn't sure he deserved. "Dad, I was wondering if you'd like to host Christmas dinner this year," he'd said, the words coming out in a rush. I know it's short notice, but Jessica thought it might be nice to have everyone together at the old house. For the kids, you know. I'd been surprised. Tommy hadn't shown much interest in family traditions since Martha died. He'd attended the necessary events, the funeral, Emma's birthday party, Sarah's graduation from nursing school, but always with the distracted air of someone checking items off a list. His work had consumed him even more after the funeral, this endless cycle of conferences and client meetings and late nights at the office. Real estate development, he called it, though it seemed to involve more PowerPoints than actual development. Of course, I'd told him. I'll get a turkey from Kowalczyk's market. Your mother always said their birds were the best in town. There had been a pause, long enough that I had wondered if the call had dropped. Then Tommy had cleared his throat. Actually, Dad, there's something I need to tell everyone. Something important. I think Christmas dinner would be the right time. The way he'd said it had made something cold settle in my stomach, but I'd kept my voice steady. All right, son, whatever you need to say, we'll listen. Now, standing in the garage with the scent of cherry wood in my nostrils and Johnny Mathis crooning about silver bells, I couldn't shake the feeling that Tommy's announcement was going to change things in ways I wasn't prepared for. But then again, the past 2 years had been full of changes I hadn't been prepared for. Martha's diagnosis, the months of treatments that left her exhausted but determined, the final weeks when we'd both known the fight was ending, but neither of us had wanted to say it out loud. I opened the bottom drawer of my tool chest and pulled out the small manila envelope I'd placed there last month. Inside were the papers from Peterson and Associates, the trust attorneys Martha and I had consulted 5 years ago when we decided to get our affairs in order. The lake house up in Traverse City, our little slice of heaven where we'd spent 2 weeks every August for 26 years, would eventually go to the Tommy and Sarah, but Martha had insisted on certain conditions. The property was held in trust now, with specific instructions about its use and care. Martha had been particular about the lake house. It wasn't just property to her, it was the repository of our best memories, the place where we'd taught the kids to fish and swim, where we'd sat on the dock every evening watching the sun set over the water, while citronella candles kept the mosquitoes at bay. She'd made me promise to be careful about what happened to it after we were gone. It's not about the money, Frank, she'd said, lying in the hospital bed with her hair wrapped in the soft blue scarf Sarah had brought her. It's about what that place represents. I don't want it to become just another rental property or get sold off to strangers who will tear it down for a bigger house. Promise me you'll protect what we built there. I'd promised, and I'd meant it, but lately Tommy had been making comments about optimizing the family assets and maximizing revenue streams. Corporate speak that made my teeth ache. I'd tried to explain Martha's wishes, but Tommy had a way of redirecting conversations toward spreadsheets and market analyses, as if love could be quantified in quarterly reports. The jewelry box was smooth under my palm now, ready for the first coat of oil. I carried it to the small finishing area Martha had set up near the side window, where the natural light was better. She'd been the detail person between us, the one who insisted on perfect joints and flawless finishes. I was more of a rough carpenter, good with the structural work, but impatient with the finer points. She'd taught me to slow down, to appreciate the process instead of rushing toward completion. As I opened the can of Danish oil, the phone rang in the kitchen. I could hear it through the thin wall between the garage and the house. That old rotary phone Martha had refused to replace because she liked the solid weight of the receiver in her hand. I let it ring, focused on applying the first coat of oil in thin, even strokes. The wood darkened beautifully, the grain popping into sharp relief. The phone stopped ringing, then started again almost immediately. This time, I set down the brush and went inside to answer it. Frank, it's Tommy. His voice was tight with something I couldn't identify. Excitement, maybe, or anxiety. I wanted to make sure we were still on for tomorrow night. Jessica's bringing her famous green bean casserole, and I've got something special planned for dessert. Tomorrow's Christmas Eve, son. Dinner's Christmas Day. Right, of course, Christmas Day. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Dad, I need to ask you something about the lake house. There it was, the cold thing in my stomach spread outward, reaching toward my chest. What about it? Well, I've been doing some research, looking into vacation rental markets in northern Michigan. The potential income from that property could be substantial, especially if we updated it a bit. New kitchen, maybe add a second bathroom. We could probably net 30-40,000 a year easy. I closed my eyes and leaned against the kitchen counter. Through the window, I could see the oak tree in the backyard where we'd hung Tommy's tire swing when he was 7. Martha had worried it was too high, but Tommy had begged for weeks, promising he'd be careful. Your mother had specific ideas about what should happen to that place, I said finally. I know, Dad, but things change. The market's hot right now, and it seems wasteful to let that kind of revenue potential just sit there unused 11 months of the year. I mean, we could use the income to, I don't know, set up college funds for the grandkids, make the money work for us. The grandkids, Emma with her gap-toothed grin and her collection of smooth stones from the lake house beach. Sarah's boy, Michael, who just turned 4 and still called me Grandpa Frank in a voice like warm honey. Tommy was talking about their future, but all I could hear was Martha's voice. Promise me you'll protect what we built there. We'll talk about it after Christmas, I said. Family business can wait until after the holiday. Sure, Dad, absolutely. But maybe you could just think about it, look at the big picture. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the oak table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together. Martha's chair was pushed in at the proper angle, the way she'd always left it. I hadn't moved it since the funeral, hadn't been able to bring myself to pull it back out and sit down for a formal meal by myself. The table was set for 1 now, had been for 18 months, a single-place setting at the head, where I could look out the window while I ate my toast and coffee each morning. But Christmas dinner would require all 6 chairs again. Tommy and Jessica, Emma, Sarah, and her husband David, little Michael. It would be the first time since the funeral that we'd all been together in this house. I walked back to the garage and picked up the brush, applying the second coat of oil to the jewelry box. The wood was singing now, the color deep and rich in the afternoon light. Emma would love it, I was sure of that. She had her grandmother's appreciation for beautiful things, and at 8, she was old enough to understand that someone had spent time making something special just for her. The radio was playing, "I'll Be Home for Christmas Now," and I found myself humming along as I worked. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, light flakes that caught the wind and swirled past the garage window. By tomorrow night, we'd probably have another couple of inches on top of what was already on the ground. Martha had loved snow at Christmas. She'd stand at the kitchen window Christmas morning, coffee cup in hand, and watch it fall while the turkey roasted in the oven. She'd claimed it made everything look clean and possible, as if the world were starting fresh. I'd always been more practical about snow, thinking about shoveling and driving conditions and whether we had enough salt for the front walk. But she'd worn me down over the years. Now when I looked at snow, I tried to see it through her eyes first. The jewelry box was perfect now, the wood glowing under its protective finish. I carried it to the workbench and set it in the spot where it would spend the night curing. Tomorrow, I'd add the final coat, and Christmas morning, it would be ready to give to Emma. Inside, in the hidden compartment, Martha's letter waited like a promise. I cleaned my brushes and put away the oil, going through the familiar ritual of closing down the workshop for the day. Tools back in their proper places, drop cloths folded, work surface wiped clean. Order was important. Martha had taught me that too. Take care of your tools and your workspace, and they'll take care of you. As I reached for the light switch, my eyes fell on Martha's socket set again. On impulse, I opened the case and counted the pieces. The 916 was indeed missing, but everything else was there, organized and ready for use. Maybe tomorrow I'd look for that missing socket, see if I could put the set back together the way she'd left it. I turned off the lights and headed for the house, snow crunching under my boots. Tomorrow would bring Christmas Eve, and the day after that, Christmas dinner with the whole family. Tommy would make his announcement, whatever it was, and we'd deal with whatever came next the way we always had, together, as a family. But as I climbed the back steps and reached for the kitchen door, that cold feeling in my stomach reminded me that families, like tools, sometimes broke in ways you couldn't fix with simple maintenance. Sometimes the damage went deeper than surface scratches, deeper than could be reached with sandpaper and oil and patience. Inside, the house was warm and quiet, filled with the lingering scent of the coffee I'd brewed that morning. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door and looked around the kitchen that Martha and I had remodeled 15 years ago, when we'd finally saved enough for the granite countertops she'd wanted. Everything was clean and ready for tomorrow's preparations. The good china washed and stored in the hutch, the silver polished and wrapped in soft cloth, the dining room table already set with Martha's Christmas tablecloth, the one with the holly pattern that she'd embroidered herself during our early years of marriage. Christmas dinner would happen here tomorrow night, in this house where we'd celebrated every important moment of our lives together. And whatever Tommy needed to tell us, whatever announcement he thought was important enough to gather the whole family, we'd face it together in the place where Martha's love still lived in every carefully chosen detail, every tradition lovingly maintained. The jewelry box would be ready by then, Emma's gift complete and perfect. And in its hidden compartment, Martha's words would wait to be discovered. A grandmother's wisdom preserved in careful script, love made tangible in cherry wood and purple velvet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in fresh possibility, just the way Martha had always said it would. Christmas Day arrived with the kind of crystalline cold that made the snow squeak under your boots and turned your breath into small clouds that hung in the air for a moment before disappearing. I'd been up since 5:30, the way I always was on holidays, some internal clock that Martha used to tease me about still ticking away, regardless of whether there was anyone left to share the early morning quiet with. The turkey was already in the oven, a 22-pound bird from Kowalczyk's that would feed our family of 7, with plenty left over for sandwiches the next day. Martha's recipe card was propped against the salt and pepper shakers, her handwriting still clear and confident across the yellowed index card. 325 degrees, 20 minutes per pound, based every hour, tent with foil if browning too fast. She'd written little notes in the margins over the years. Add more sage, David likes dark meat, save wishbone for Emma. I followed her instructions exactly, the way I had for the past 18 months, when cooking had become my responsibility by default. The kitchen felt different on Christmas morning, with all the familiar rituals playing out in solitude. Usually Martha would have been moving around the space like a dancer, pulling dishes from the oven, while simultaneously checking the progress of 3 other things, her timing so perfect that everything finished at exactly the same moment. I was more methodical, working from lists she'd left behind, following the choreography she'd perfected over decades of holiday meals. The dining room table was set with our good china, the Spode Christmas tree pattern we'd bought piece by piece during our first years of marriage, back when spending $60 on a serving platter had required 3 months of debate and careful budgeting. The centerpiece was Martha's handiwork, too. Arrangement of pine boughs and red ribbon she'd made 2 Christmases ago that I'd carefully preserved in the basement, bringing it up each December like a sacred relic. Sarah arrived first, as she always did, carrying 4-year-old Michael on her hip and balancing a covered dish that I knew would be her famous sweet potato casserole with the marshmallow topping that made Michael's eyes go wide with anticipation. Her husband David followed behind with their contribution to the meal, a bottle of wine that probably cost more than the turkey, though he'd never mentioned the price. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Sarah said, kissing my cheek as she handed off Michael, who immediately began chattering about Santa Claus and the bicycle that had appeared under their tree that morning. Sarah had Martha's way of moving through a space, efficient and graceful, already heading toward the kitchen to check on things without being asked. "Something smells incredible in here," David said, shaking my hand with the firm grip he'd cultivated in his years as a bank manager. "Just like Martha used to make." I nodded, accepting the compliment, though we both knew it wasn't quite true. The turkey would be perfectly cooked, and the side dishes would taste right. But there was something indefinable missing, some quality of attention or love that Martha had brought to every meal that I couldn't quite replicate, no matter how carefully I followed her recipes. Michael was tugging on my sweater, demanding to know whether Emma was coming, and whether there would be pie, and whether Grandpa Frank had remembered to leave cookies for Santa. I answered his questions while my eyes kept drifting to the window, watching for Tommy's silver BMW to pull into the driveway. They arrived 20 minutes later than expected, Tommy emerging from the driver's seat with the slightly harried look of someone who'd been dealing with traffic and a cranky 8-year-old for the past hour. Jessica climbed out of the passenger side carrying her famous green bean casserole, the one that Tommy always praised with slightly too much enthusiasm, as if he were trying to convince himself that his wife's cooking measured up to his mother's. Emma burst through the front door ahead of her parents, a whirlwind of red velvet dress and carefully curled hair that immediately became disheveled as she threw herself into my arms. She smelled like the lavender soap Jessica favored, and something sweeter. Candy canes, maybe, or the sugar cookies they'd probably had for breakfast. Grandpa Frank, did you see how much snow we got? Mom said we might be able to build a snowman after dinner if it's not too cold, and Daddy said you might have a surprise for me, and... Slow down there, little rabbit, I said, using Martha's pet name for her. Let's get your coat off first, then we can talk about surprises. Tommy appeared in the doorway carrying a leather messenger bag that seemed oddly formal for Christmas dinner. He set it down carefully by the front door, positioning it with the kind of precision that suggested its contents were important. When he looked up, his expression was strange, excited but nervous, like a man about to give a speech he'd been rehearsing for weeks. "Dad," he said, shaking my hand with both of his. "Thanks for hosting. The house looks great, really great." There was something in his voice that hadn't been there during our phone conversation, an undercurrent of energy that made me think of the way he'd sounded as a teenager when he was working up the courage to ask for car keys or permission to stay out past curfew. But Tommy was 36 years old now, long past the age when he needed my permission for anything. We gathered in the living room for our traditional pre-dinner drink, wine for the adults, apple cider for Emma and Michael. I poured myself 2 fingers of the bourbon Martha had given me for our last Christmas together, a bottle I'd been saving for special occasions. If Christmas dinner with the whole family wasn't special enough, I figured nothing would be. Tommy positioned himself near the fireplace, one elbow resting on the mantel where Martha's photograph smiled down at all of us. He'd always been good at commanding a room, even as a child, and I could see him unconsciously falling into the same stance he probably used when addressing potential investors or city planning committees. "Before we eat," he said, raising his wine glass, "I wanted to propose a toast to family and to new beginnings, and to the importance of honesty in all our relationships." The words hung in the air strangely, more formal than our usual Christmas toasts. Sarah raised her glass with a questioning look, while Jessica smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Emma was more interested in trying to catch snowflakes on the window with her finger, and Michael had discovered the wooden nativity set on the side table and was quietly rearranging the wise men. We drank and then moved to the dining room where the turkey waited in golden perfection, surrounded by all the traditional accompaniments. The table was beautiful in the way that only comes from years of accumulated tradition. Each dish in its proper place, each serving utensil exactly where Martha would have put it. I carved the turkey while everyone found their seats, the familiar ritual of Christmas dinner unfolding around us. Emma chattered about her morning, describing each present with the kind of detailed enthusiasm that only 8-year-olds can sustain. Michael helped David arrange his food into careful piles that couldn't touch each other. Sarah and Jessica made conversation about the weather and the traffic, and whether the roads would be clear enough for everyone to get home safely. But Tommy was quiet, eating mechanically while his eyes kept drifting to the messenger bag he'd left by the front door. Whatever he'd brought with him was clearly more important than the meal, though he was making an effort to participate in the family conversation. "Emma," I said, reaching under my chair for the jewelry box I'd wrapped in silver paper, "I have something special for you." Her eyes lit up as she took the box, turning it over in her hands before carefully peeling away the tape. Martha had taught her to open presents properly, saving the paper and taking time to appreciate the gift before moving on to the next one. When she lifted the lid and saw the cherry wood gleaming in the candlelight, she gasped. "Grandpa Frank, it's beautiful!" "Look, Mom, it's just like the one Grandma had, but smaller." She ran her fingers over the smooth finish, then looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Did you make this just for me?" "Every piece," I said. "Your grandmother helped me design it. There's even a secret compartment in the bottom. See this little catch here? But that's for when you're older." Emma carefully closed the box and hugged it to her chest, and for a moment the dining room was filled with the kind of perfect silence that makes you believe in the possibility of happiness. Then Tommy cleared his throat and pushed back from the table. "Actually," he said, "before we move on to dessert, there's something I need to share with everyone. Something important." He walked to the front hall and returned with his messenger bag, setting it on the sideboard with careful ceremony. Sarah and David exchanged glances, while Jessica's smile became even more strained. Emma was still absorbed in examining her jewelry box, but something in Tommy's tone made even Michael look up from his mashed potatoes. I've been doing some research lately, Tommy began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a prepared presentation. Looking into family history, genealogy, that sort of thing. You know how important it is to understand where we come from, to know the truth about our heritage. He opened the messenger bag and pulled out a manila folder, then a small USB drive, then something that made my blood turn cold, a sealed envelope from a DNA testing company. The thing is, Tommy continued, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that reminded me of Martha when she was determined to make a point. Sometimes the truth isn't what we've been told. Sometimes families have secrets that get buried for years, and it's not until someone takes the initiative to dig a little deeper that the real story comes to light. Sarah was frowning now, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. Tommy, what are you talking about? He opened the manila folder and pulled out several sheets of paper, printouts from websites, photocopied documents, what looked like birth certificates or medical records. The sight of them spread across Martha's Christmas tablecloth felt like sacrilege. I'm talking about honesty, Tommy said, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. I'm talking about the right to know who we really are, where we really come from. I'm talking about 36 years of lies. The last word hit the dining room like a physical blow. Emma looked up from her jewelry box with confusion, while Michael started to whimper at the sudden tension in the air. Jessica reached over and touched Tommy's arm, but he shook her off. The DNA test came back 3 weeks ago, he said, pulling the results from the envelope with a flourish that felt rehearsed. 99.9% certainty. I am not biologically related to the man who raised me. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the old house seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I could feel everyone's eyes turning toward me, but I kept my gaze fixed on the turkey carcass in front of me, the bones picked clean and gleaming white against the serving platter. I've been investigating this for months, Tommy continued, his voice gaining momentum like a prosecutor, building toward his closing argument. Following paper trails, reaching out to distant relatives, piecing together a timeline that finally makes sense. Mom had an affair in 1987. I was born 9 months later. The man I called Dad for 36 years knew about it and chose to keep it a secret. He was looking directly at me now, his face flushed with righteous anger and something else, hurt maybe, or disappointment. The little boy who used to climb into my lap to hear bedtime stories was gone, replaced by this stranger who spoke in accusations and demanded explanations for choices made before he was old enough to understand the weight of them. All these years, he said, his voice dropping to something almost like a whisper. All these years of family dinners and Christmas mornings and father-son talks about integrity and honesty and doing the right thing, and the whole time, our entire relationship was built on a lie. Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she reached for David's hand. Emma had set down her jewelry box and was staring at her father with wide, frightened eyes. Michael had begun to cry in earnest, the kind of full-throated wailing that comes when children sense that the adult world has suddenly become unsafe. I stood up slowly, my napkin falling to the floor as I pushed back from the table. The dining room felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in as 36 years of Christmas dinners and birthday parties and quiet Sunday afternoons collapsed into this single moment of reckoning. "Tommy," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "That's enough." But he wasn't finished. He pulled out more papers, printed emails, photographs, a timeline he'd constructed with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. The evidence of my son's investigation spread across Martha's Christmas table, like an accusation, like proof of some crime I'd committed simply by loving him. "I know about the letters," he said, holding up what looked like photocopies of old correspondence. "I found a distant cousin on Mom's side who remembered things, who kept records. I know about the fights you and Mom had that summer, about the separation that nobody talks about the man she was seeing while you were staying at the lake house. The lake house. Of course it would come back to that. To the place where Martha and I had worked so hard to rebuild what we'd almost lost, where we'd made the choices that shaped the rest of our lives. I could see it in Tommy's eyes, not just the hurt of discovery, but the calculation, the way he was already thinking about property values and inheritance rights and what this revelation might mean for his financial future. "That's enough," I said again, But this time, there was steel in my voice, the tone I'd used when he was 12 and pushing boundaries just to see how far he could go. We're going to finish this meal, and then, if you want to talk about family history, we can do it properly, but not here, not like this, and not in front of the children. Tommy's face flushed darker. Don't you think we have a right to know? Don't you think Sarah has a right to know that her brother isn't really her brother? Don't you think your grandchildren have a right to know the truth about their family? I looked around the table at the faces I'd loved most in the world. Sarah's tear-streaked cheeks, Emma's confusion, Michael's fear, David's careful neutrality, Jessica's embarrassment. The Christmas dinner Martha had planned so carefully had become something else entirely, a courtroom where my son was prosecutor and judge, demanding answers to questions that had been settled long before he was old enough to ask them. From the kitchen came the sound of breaking glass, one of the wine glasses toppling from the counter where I'd left it earlier, shattering against the tile floor in a crash that seemed to echo through the house like an omen. "The truth," I said quietly, looking directly at Tommy for the first time since his announcement began, "is more complicated than you think. And tonight, after we finish eating and after the children have gone home, I'll tell you everything you want to know. But I'll tell you the whole truth, not just the parts that fit your timeline." I sat back down and picked up my fork, cutting a piece of turkey with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Around the table, the others slowly began to do the same, the mechanics of eating providing a refuge from the emotional storm that had just torn through our Christmas dinner. But I could feel Tommy's eyes on me, burning with questions and accusations, and I knew that the quiet reckoning I'd been expecting since his phone call was still coming. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by this man who measured love in DNA percentages and built his sense of identity on genetic certainties that had never mattered to the family that had shaped him. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, marking the passage of another hour in a day that had already lasted far too long. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in fresh whiteness that would be gone by morning, melted and dirty and forgotten. Just like the Christmas dinner that was supposed to bring us together, but had instead torn us apart. The remainder of dinner passed in a silence thick as fog, broken only by the scrape of silverware against china and Michael's occasional sniffles. Emma had retreated into herself, clutching her jewelry box like a talisman while stealing worried glances between her father and me. Sarah made valiant attempts at normal conversation, asking about Emma's school play, commenting on how tender the turkey was, but each effort fell flat against the weight of Tommy's revelation. Jessica excused herself twice to check on something in the kitchen, though we all knew she was simply escaping the suffocating tension that had settled over Martha's dining room like a burial shroud. When she returned the second time, her eyes were red-rimmed, and she avoided looking at anyone directly. Tommy sat rigid in his chair, occasionally reaching into his messenger bag to arrange and rearrange his evidence, as if organizing the papers could somehow organize the chaos he'd unleashed. He'd barely touched his plate, too consumed with the momentum of his disclosure to eat, but he remained at the table like a prosecutor, waiting for his moment to resume cross-examination. When Emma asked quietly if she could be excused to play with her new jewelry box, I nodded, grateful to have at least one innocent soul removed from the battlefield my dining room had become. She slipped away to the living room, where I could hear her humming Christmas carols to herself as she explored the box's various compartments. "Dad," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "is it true what Tommy said?" I set down my coffee cup and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, seeing Martha's eyes and Martha's stubborn chin and the same fierce loyalty that had kept our family intact through every crisis we'd faced. Sarah had been 14 when Tommy was born, old enough to remember the difficult months before his arrival, though we'd thought we'd shielded her from the worst of it. "It's complicated, sweetheart," I said. "Your brother has some facts, but facts without context can be misleading." Tommy's head snapped up. "Facts are facts, Dad. DNA doesn't lie. The timeline doesn't lie. The records I found don't lie." "Neither do 36 years of bedtime stories," I replied quietly. "Neither do Little League games and science fair projects, and the night you broke your arm falling off your bike and I carried you 6 blocks to the emergency room because the car wouldn't start. That's not the point. That's exactly the point." My voice carried more steel now, the tone that had settled neighborhood disputes and handled difficult clients during my 40 years in construction management. Being a father isn't about biology, Thomas. It's about choice. It's about showing up every day and making the decision to love and protect and guide, regardless of whose DNA contributed to the mix. I could see him preparing his counter-argument, pulling out more papers from his bag like ammunition. Among them, I noticed, were printouts of what looked like property records and inheritance documents. The sight of them confirmed what I'd suspected since his first phone call about the lake house. This wasn't just about family secrets. This was about money, about inheritance rights, about his fear that somehow his lack of biological connection might affect his claim to family assets. "Let me tell you what your timeline doesn't show," I continued, standing up from the table. "Let me tell you about the summer of 1987, since you're so interested in the facts." I walked to the china cabinet where Martha had kept our photo albums, pulling out the thick leather-bound book that chronicled our early married years. The pages were heavy with memories: our wedding, our first apartment, Sarah's baby pictures, the house we'd bought when she was 3. "Your mother and I were 26 when we got married," I said, opening the album to our wedding photos. "We thought we knew everything about love and commitment. We thought marriage would be easy because we loved each other." Sarah came to stand beside me, her finger tracing the edge of a photo where Martha looked impossibly young in her simple white dress. Tommy remained seated, but I could see his attention caught despite his determination to stay angry. By 1987, we'd been married 13 years. Sarah was in junior high. I was working 60-hour weeks trying to establish my business. And your mother was... I paused, choosing my words carefully. Your mother was lonely. We both were, in different ways. I turned the pages slowly, finding the photos from that difficult summer, Martha at the lake house, looking tired and distant. Sarah building sandcastles alone while we sat in lawn chairs, not talking. The pictures told their own story of a marriage under strain. "We separated for 3 months," I said simply. "July through September. I moved into the lake house, convinced that we were done, that 13 years hadn't been enough to build something worth saving." Tommy's facade cracked slightly. "You never told us you separated." "You were 14, Sarah. You didn't need to carry the weight of your parents' problems. And Tommy..." I looked directly at my son. "You didn't exist yet." I closed the album and returned to my seat, my hands steady on the table. "Your mother met someone during those months. A good man, actually. Someone who made her laugh when she'd forgotten how to laugh, who reminded her what it felt like to be seen and appreciated." Jessica had gone very still, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. Sarah was crying silently, tears dropping onto her Christmas dress. But Tommy was leaning forward now, his anger temporarily replaced by something closer to curiosity. "I found out about him in August," I continued. "Not because your mother confessed, but because Mrs. Kowalski saw them together at the farmer's market and felt obligated to inform me, the way neighbors did in those days." The memory was still sharp after all these years, standing in the empty lake house with Helen Kowalski's words echoing in my head, feeling like my chest had been hollowed out with a spoon. I'd driven back to town that same day, prepared to file for divorce, to divide our assets and custody and start over at 39 with nothing but my pride intact. I was furious, I said, hurt and furious and ready to burn everything down. I had papers drawn up. I was going to take Sarah and move to Colorado, where my brother lived. I was going to start fresh where nobody knew us. "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked softly. I smiled, remembering the moment that had altered the trajectory of all our lives. "Your mother came to the lake house on Labor Day weekend, showed up with a suitcase and a thermos of coffee, and the kind of determination that had made me fall in love with her in the first place. Martha standing on the dock in her yellow sundress, her hair longer than she usually wore it, her face serious but hopeful. She'd looked like a woman prepared to fight for something worth saving. She told me about him," I said. "About the affair, about feeling invisible in our marriage, about the loneliness that had driven her to seek comfort somewhere else. But she also told me about the choice she was making." I reached for my coffee cup, buying time to compose myself. Even now, 37 years later, the memory of that conversation could take my breath away. "She chose us," I said simply. "Chose our marriage, chose our family, chose the possibility that we could build something better than what we'd had before. And she asked me to choose too." Tommy was quiet now, his papers forgotten. Did you know about the pregnancy? Not then. She didn't know herself until October. But when she told me, I shrugged. It didn't matter whose DNA had contributed to your existence. You were going to be born into our family, raised by parents who had chosen to recommit to each other, loved by a sister who was already planning what she wanted to teach you. I looked around the table at these people who had shaped my life for 4 decades. Your mother and I never lied to you, Thomas. We simply chose not to burden you with information that had no bearing on how much you were loved or wanted or celebrated. But I had a right to know, Tommy insisted, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Did you? I asked. What would that knowledge have given you at age 5, or 10, or 15? What would it have added to your life except questions and confusion and the kind of identity crisis you're having right now? I stood up again, this time walking to the sideboard where Martha's Christmas decorations still held court. Among them was a small framed photo from Tommy's first Christmas, him as a 2-month-old baby. Sleeping in my arms while I dozed in the rocking chair Martha had insisted we needed for the nursery. This is who I am, I said, handing him the photo. This is who I've always been. Not your biological father, but your dad. The man who walked the floor with you when you had colic. The man who taught you to throw a curveball and helped you with algebra and drove you to college when you were 18 and terrified of leaving home. Tommy stared at the photo for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I found letters, he said quietly. Email correspondence with a cousin I'd never heard of. She remembered things, told stories about family gatherings, where people whispered about Mom's situation. Made it sound like everyone knew except me. The pain in his voice was raw now, stripped of the righteous anger that had carried him through his earlier accusations. This was the hurt underneath, not just the discovery of biological truth, but the feeling that he'd been the only one left out of a family secret. Some people probably suspected, I said gently. Small town, long memories, the way people count months between weddings and babies. But it didn't matter to anyone who loved you. It certainly didn't matter to your mother or to me. But the lake house, Tommy said, pulling out property documents with hands that shook slightly. The inheritance, the trust documents. Does this change anything legally? There it was, finally, the real fear underneath all his research and documentation. Not just who he was, but what he was entitled to. Not just family identity, but family assets. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to value integrity and family above financial gain, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Is that what this is really about, Thomas? The money? His face flushed red. No, of course not. It's about honesty, because if it is, I continued, my voice deadly quiet, if this performance tonight was designed to establish your legal standing before we discuss the disposition of family property, then you've succeeded in ways you didn't intend. The dining room went completely silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to hold its breath. What do you mean? Tommy asked. I looked around the table one more time, at Sarah's horrified expression, at Jessica's embarrassment, at Emma in the doorway, clutching her jewelry box and trying to understand why Christmas had turned into something frightening. I mean, I said carefully, that there are things about your mother's wishes that you don't know yet. Things about the lake house and the trust and the conditions she insisted on including. Things that your DNA test and your timeline research couldn't have uncovered. I walked to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the sudden silence, and poured myself another cup of coffee with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Behind me, I could hear Tommy shuffling through his papers again, but with less confidence now, as if he was beginning to realize that his investigation might have missed some crucial piece of information. When I returned to the dining room, everyone was watching me with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The Christmas dinner that was supposed to celebrate our family had become something else entirely. A reckoning that had been building for 18 months, ever since Martha's death, had left me as the sole keeper of secrets we'd thought would stay buried forever. Tommy, I said, setting my coffee cup down with deliberate precision, you've told us your truth tonight. You've shared your research and your timeline and your DNA results. You've accused your mother and me of dishonesty and deception. I met his eyes directly, seeing the boy he'd been and the man he'd become and the stranger he was threatening to turn into. Now it's my turn to share some facts with you. Facts that your cousin and your genealogy websites and your genetic testing couldn't uncover. Facts that might change how you feel about the choices your mother and I made all those years ago. I walked to the front hall closet, to the space behind Martha's winter coats, where I'd hidden something 18 months ago, something I'd hoped I'd never need to retrieve. But first, I said, returning to the dining room with a small wooden box in my hands. You need to understand something about secrets and truth, and the difference between facts and wisdom. The box was made of cherry wood, like Emma's jewelry box, but older, more worn. Martha had made it herself during the early years of our marriage, before arthritis had made fine woodworking too difficult. It had sat on her dresser for decades, holding the small treasures she couldn't bear to throw away. Ticket stubs from our first date, the hospital bracelet from Sarah's birth, the letter I'd written her during my brief deployment to Germany in 1975. Your mother left instructions, I said, setting the box on the table among Tommy's scattered evidence. Very specific instructions about what should happen if anyone ever challenged the choices we made as a family. I opened the box slowly, revealing its contents. A sealed envelope with Tommy's name, written in Martha's careful script, a USB drive, and a folder of legal documents that made Tommy's research look amateur by comparison. She knew this day might come, I said. She hoped it wouldn't, but she prepared for it anyway, because that's who your mother was, someone who thought 3 steps ahead and planned for every contingency. Tommy was staring at the box as if it contained explosives. What is that? That, I said, is the rest of the story, the part your timeline missed. The part that explains not just what happened in 1987, but why it happened, and what your mother wanted you to know if you ever discovered the truth about your biological parentage. I looked around the table one more time, at the faces of the people I loved most in the world, gathered in the dining room where we'd celebrated every milestone and weathered every crisis for the past 4 decades. But that's a conversation for after the children go home, I said finally. Because some truths are too heavy for 8-year-olds to carry, even when they're wrapped in good intentions. Emma appeared at my elbow then, tugging on my sweater with the persistence that only grandchildren could muster. Grandpa Frank, she whispered, can we still have pie? I've been really good, and I want to show everyone the secret compartment in my box. I looked down at her upturned face, so much like Martha's at that age, full of trust and hope, and the unshakable belief that adults would protect her from the sharp edges of a complicated world. Of course we can have pie, little rabbit, I said, lifting her into my arms. Christmas isn't over yet. But as I carried her toward the kitchen, I could feel Tommy's eyes on the cherry wood box, and I knew that the hardest part of this long day was still ahead of us. The real reckoning was just beginning. The house settled into an uneasy quiet after Sarah and David left with Michael, who had fallen asleep in his car seat clutching a candy cane and one of the wooden wise men from the nativity set. Emma had gone home reluctantly, her new jewelry box tucked carefully under her arm, after extracting promises that we'd have another family dinner soon, where everyone would be happy again. Jessica had retreated to the living room with a cup of tea and her phone, texting what I assumed were apologies to her own family for the evening's disruption. Tommy sat at the dining room table like a defendant awaiting sentencing, his messenger bag of evidence pushed to one side, his attention fixed entirely on the cherry wood box that contained Martha's final words on the subject of family secrets. I cleared the dinner dishes methodically, taking my time with each plate and glass, following the rhythm Martha had established over decades of the post-meal cleanup. The routine was comforting, a reminder that some things remained constant even when others fell apart. Tommy made no move to help, too absorbed in whatever scenarios were playing out in his head. When the last dish was loaded into the dishwasher and the tablecloth shaken out and folded, I returned to the dining room and sat down across from my son. The cherry wood box sat between us like a small altar, its contents holding the power to either heal the wounds opened tonight or deepen them beyond repair. Before we open this, I said, resting my hands flat on the table, I need you to understand something about your mother. She wasn't a woman who acted impulsively or carelessly. Everything she did, especially during those difficult months in 1987, was deliberate and considered. Tommy nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the box. I just want to understand what really happened. All of it. I opened the lid slowly, revealing the 3 items Martha had placed there during her final weeks: the sealed envelope with Tommy's name, the USB drive, and the folder of legal documents that represented months of careful planning. The envelope was thick, multiple pages written in the precise handwriting that had helped her through a career as a high school English teacher. "She wrote this letter in April, 2 months before she died," I said, lifting the envelope carefully. "She made me promise not to open it, not to read it before giving it to you. She said if the day ever came when you needed to know the whole truth, her words should be the first ones you heard, not mine." I handed him the envelope, watching as he turned it over in his hands. His name was written across the front in Martha's teacher handwriting, the kind of careful script that had graced thousands of report cards and recommendation letters over her 30-year career. "Read it," I said, "out loud if you're comfortable. I think we could all use the sound of her voice right now." Tommy's hands shook slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded the pages, 3 sheets of the cream-colored stationery Martha had used for important correspondence. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice barely above a whisper. "My dearest Thomas," he began, and immediately his voice cracked. Martha's words, even filtered through his reading, carried the warmth and authority that had made her such an effective teacher and beloved mother. "If you're reading this letter, it means you've discovered the truth about your biological parentage, and I imagine you're feeling hurt and confused, and perhaps betrayed by the choices your father and I made 36 years ago. I hope this letter will help you understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and why we chose to protect you from this knowledge for as long as possible." Tommy paused, looking up at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "Dad, I don't know if I can—" "Keep going," I said gently. "She has things to tell you that I never could." He took a shaky breath and continued. "The summer of 1987 was the darkest period of my marriage to your father. We had grown apart in ways that seemed insurmountable, lost in our separate struggles and failures to communicate. I felt invisible in my own home, unappreciated and unloved, though I understand now that Frank was fighting his own battles with work stress and his father's recent death. The mention of my father's passing that spring brought back memories I'd pushed aside for decades. Dad had died of a heart attack in March 1987, leaving me to settle his affairs while simultaneously trying to save a construction project that was hemorrhaging money. I'd been so consumed with survival that I'd failed to notice Martha drowning in her own loneliness. When we separated in July, Tommy continued reading, I thought our marriage was over. 13 years felt like nothing compared to the weight of our accumulated disappointments and resentments. I was angry at Frank for choosing work over family, and he was angry at me for what he saw as my selfishness and demands for attention. I remembered those arguments, the way we'd circled each other like wounded animals, each convinced the other was the source of our problems. The separation had felt like relief at first, a chance to breathe without the constant tension of trying to fix something that seemed irreparably broken. During those 3 months apart, I met someone, Tommy read, his voice growing steadier as he fell into the rhythm of his mother's words. Someone who made me feel seen and valued and beautiful again. Robert was recently divorced, understanding about the complexities of failed relationships, and kind in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Robert, I'd never known his name, had deliberately avoided learning the details of Martha's relationship with him. Some facts were too sharp to hold safely. I want you to understand that what happened between Robert and me wasn't casual or thoughtless, the letter continued. I fell in love with him, completely and genuinely. And for 6 weeks that summer, I believed I was going to divorce your father and start a new life with someone who truly appreciated me. Tommy looked up again, his face pale. Mom was going to leave you? Keep reading, I said, though the words were difficult to get out. Martha had never told me how serious her relationship with Robert had become, how close we'd come to losing everything. But love, real love, isn't just about feeling appreciated or desired, Tommy continued reading. It's about choosing to build something lasting with someone who shares your deepest values and commitments. And when I had to choose between the excitement of new love and the foundation of the life Frank and I had built together, I chose the foundation. I remembered Labor Day weekend, 1987, when Martha had appeared at the lake house with her suitcase and her thermos of coffee. I'd been prepared for her to ask for a divorce, had my own papers ready to serve. Instead, she'd sat across from me at the small kitchen table and asked if we could try again. Robert was a good man, the letter went on, but Frank was my partner, the father of my daughter, the man who'd held my hand through my mother's death and celebrated every small victory in my teaching career and built our home with his own hands. Robert offered me romance, but Frank offered me a life. Tommy's voice was thick now, each word requiring effort. I ended the relationship with Robert in September, and Frank and I began the slow work of rebuilding our marriage. We went to counseling. We established new patterns of communication. We remembered why we'd fallen in love in the first place. By October, when I discovered I was pregnant with you, we were stronger than we'd been in years. The pregnancy. Martha had been terrified when she'd missed her period, then gotten the positive test result. We'd sat in Dr. Henderson's office holding hands while he confirmed what we already knew, that our second chance at marriage was going to include an unexpected child. The question of paternity was immediate and unavoidable, Tommy read. We knew the timing made it impossible to be certain without testing, but we also knew that it didn't matter. You were going to be our child, born into a marriage we'd chosen to rebuild, raised by parents who'd learned that love was work as much as feeling. I watched Tommy's face as he processed his mother's words, saw the shift from hurt confusion towards something approaching understanding. The biological facts that had seemed so important an hour ago were being recontextualized by Martha's explanation of the emotional landscape that had surrounded his conception. Frank and I made a conscious decision not to pursue paternity testing, the letter continued. We wanted you to be born into certainty, not questions. We wanted your childhood to be shaped by love and security, not by the complicated circumstances of your conception. You were ours from the moment we knew you existed, and that was the only truth that mattered to us. Tommy set down the first page and picked up the second, his hands steadier now. We agreed that if you ever asked direct questions about your parentage, we would tell you the truth, but you never asked, perhaps because the love between Frank and you was so natural and complete that biological connection never seemed relevant. He was your father in every way that mattered, present for your birth, devoted to your care, proud of your accomplishments, committed to your happiness. I thought about those early years, the way Tommy had looked at me with complete trust and adoration. The biology that concerned him so much now had never been a factor in our relationship. He'd been my son from the moment Martha placed him in my arms in the hospital delivery room, red-faced and screaming and perfect. As I write this letter, Tommy read, I'm dying, and I know that my death will leave Frank as the sole keeper of this secret. I've watched you both over the years, seen the way you've grown apart as you've focused more on career success and financial achievement than on family relationships. I worry that Frank's quietness about emotional matters might make it difficult for you to understand the depth of his love for you if this truth ever comes to light. The words hit like a physical blow. Martha had seen what I'd tried to ignore, the way Tommy's ambition had gradually eroded our connection, the way his visits had become more duty than pleasure, the way he'd begun to see family relationships as secondary to professional advancement. I want you to know, the letter continued, that being raised by Frank Kowalski was the greatest gift I could have given you. He chose to be your father when he could have walked away. He chose to love you when he had every reason to feel betrayed and angry. He chose every single day for 36 years to be the man you called Dad. Tommy's voice broke completely then, the words dissolving into tears that had been building all evening. I reached across the table and took the letter from his hands, continuing to read in his place. But I also want you to understand the legal implications of our choice, I read aloud. The lake house that you've expressed interest in as an investment property was purchased with money that Frank earned during the years after your birth, improved with labors he performed himself, and maintained through decades of his care and attention. I paused, looking at Tommy's face as comprehension began to dawn. The property documents in his messenger bag suddenly seemed less relevant than they had an hour ago. More importantly, I continued reading, the trust we established to preserve the lake house includes specific provisions about family behavior and values. Frank and I agreed that the property should remain a place of healing and connection, used for the benefit of future generations and the wider community, not converted into a source of rental income. I set down the letter and reached for the USB drive, holding it up so Tommy could see it clearly. Your mother recorded a video message to accompany this letter. She wanted to make sure her wishes were documented in a way that couldn't be questioned or challenged. Tommy wiped his eyes with his napkin, struggling to compose himself. What kind of provisions? I opened the folder of legal documents, pulling out the trust agreement Martha and I had signed 3 years before her death. The pages were thick with legal language, but the core message was clear enough. The trust includes what's called a family harmony clause, I explained. It gives the trustee, currently me, eventually Sarah, the authority to alter the distribution of assets if any beneficiary engages in behavior that damages family relationships or treats other family members with deliberate cruelty or disrespect. Tommy's face went white. You mean tonight, what I did tonight? Your mother anticipated this possibility, I said gently. She knew that discovering the truth about your parentage might lead to anger, to accusations, to exactly the kind of public confrontation that happened at dinner tonight. She included specific language about protecting family members from being subjected to humiliation or character assassination in front of children or extended family. I pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of a notary public. She also recorded her wishes about what should happen if anyone ever tried to use this information to challenge family inheritance or property rights. The video on this USB drive includes her final thoughts on the subject of biological versus chosen family and her specific instructions about the lake house. Tommy was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Are you telling me that because of tonight, because of what I said? I'm telling you that your mother loved you enough to protect the rest of the family from being hurt by your pain, I said. She understood that discovering this truth might make you angry, might make you want to lash out, might make you question everything you thought you knew about our family, but she also understood that allowing that anger to damage other people, especially the grandchildren, wasn't acceptable. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow that continued to fall in the darkness. The Lake House Trust can be accelerated, Thomas. Instead of passing to you and Sarah after my death, it can be donated immediately to a veterans rehabilitation program that your mother and I have been supporting for the past 5 years. The house would be used as a retreat center for combat veterans learning woodworking and other therapeutic skills. When I turned back to face him, Tommy looked like a man who'd just watched his financial future evaporate. Because of one dinner, because I was angry and hurt and said things I didn't mean, because you chose to humiliate your family in front of children, I said quietly, because you chose to turn Christmas dinner into a courtroom where you were prosecutor and judge, because you chose to prioritize your need for drama over everyone else's need for peace and dignity. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of Jessica moving around in the living room. Tommy sat with his head in his hands, the weight of consequences finally settling over him. Your mother's video message explains all of this in her own words, I said, holding up the USB drive again. She talks about love as a choice, about family as something you build rather than something you're born into, about the difference between biological connections and true kinship. She also talks about her hopes for you and her fears about the kind of man you were becoming. I set the drive down on the table between us. The choice now is yours, Thomas. We can watch this together, hear what she wanted to say to you about all of this. Or you can take your evidence and your timeline and your DNA results and leave here tonight feeling justified in your anger. Tommy looked up, his eyes red and exhausted. What happens if I choose to leave? Then tomorrow morning, I call the lawyers and begin the process of accelerating the trust donation, I said. The lake house becomes a memorial to your mother's values rather than an investment property. Your share of other family assets remains unchanged. The trust only affects the lake house and the specific funds designated for its maintenance. And if I stay, if I watch the video, I sat back down across from him, feeling every one of my 67 years in my bones. Then, we try to rebuild something from the wreckage of tonight. We try to remember that family isn't about perfection or pure motives or even complete honesty. It's about choosing to love each other despite our flaws and failures and the complicated history we all carry. Tommy stared at the USB drive for a long moment, then at the scattered papers from his messenger bag, his timeline and DNA results and email printouts that had seemed so important just hours ago. Finally, he looked at me with something approaching the expression I remembered from his childhood, when he'd made a mistake and was trying to figure out how to make it right. "Dad," he said quietly, and the single word carried more weight than all his accusations and evidence combined. "I want to hear what Mom had to say." I picked up the USB drive and walked toward the living room, where Martha's voice was waiting to speak across the months since her death, ready to offer wisdom about love and choice and the true meaning of family to the son she'd raised with such careful intention. Behind me, Tommy gathered up his papers slowly, as if he were already beginning to understand that the facts he'd worked so hard to uncover were only a small part of a much larger and more complicated truth. I woke on December 26th to the sound of snowplows scraping against asphalt, the mechanical rhythm pulling me from dreams filled with Martha's voice, and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. The bedside clock read 5:47 a.m., but I'd been awake in the gray space between sleep and consciousness for at least an hour, my mind cycling through the events of the previous evening like a record with a deep scratch. Tommy had left just after midnight, his messenger bag heavier with Martha's video message and photocopies of the trust documents than it had been when he arrived. We'd watched the recording together in silence, 23 minutes of Martha speaking directly to the camera from her hospital bed, her voice clear and steady, despite the oxygen cannula beneath her nose. She'd covered everything: the affair, the pregnancy, the choice to rebuild our marriage, and most importantly, her fears about what Tommy might become if he allowed ambition to eclipse the values we'd tried to instill in him. "I see you pulling away from us," she'd said in the video, looking directly into the camera, as if she could see through time to this exact moment. "I see you measuring relationships by what they can provide rather than what they mean. I see you treating the lake house as an asset rather than a sanctuary. And it breaks my heart because I know the boy you used to be. The boy who caught fireflies in mason jars and cried when we had to release them because keeping beautiful things captive wasn't fair to them." Tommy had wept openly during that part, and for a moment I'd seen my son again, instead of the calculating stranger who'd turned Christmas dinner into an inquisition. But when the video ended and we'd sat in the aftermath of Martha's final lesson about chosen family versus biological accident, his first question had been about the legal implications, about whether there was a way to challenge the trust provisions. Now, making coffee in the pre-dawn darkness of my kitchen, I understood that last night had been a beginning rather than an ending. Tommy would need time to process what he'd learned, to decide whether Martha's message would change his perspective or simply become another obstacle to overcome in his pursuit of financial optimization. And I would need to honor Martha's wishes about protecting the family from further damage, regardless of which choice my son ultimately made. I pulled on my work clothes and drove through the empty streets to the office of Peterson and Associates, where Douglas Peterson had agreed to meet me despite the holiday. Doug had been Martha's lawyer first, handling her mother's estate back in the 80s, and he'd become a family friend over the decades. He understood the context behind the trust provisions in ways that went beyond legal technicalities. "Frank," he said, greeting me at the door of his downtown office, "I'm sorry about last night. I know this couldn't have been easy." I'd called him after Tommy left, giving him a brief summary of the evening's revelations and their potential consequences. Doug had listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his 40 years of family law practice having prepared him for every variation of human dysfunction and disappointment. "I need to understand my options," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. Martha was very specific about the conditions that would trigger acceleration of the charitable donation, but I want to make sure I'm not acting out of anger or hurt feelings. Doug opened the file that contained our trust documents, pages that represented months of careful consideration during Martha's final year. She'd insisted on covering every contingency, every possible scenario that might threaten the family harmony she'd worked so hard to maintain. "The language is quite clear," he said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Any beneficiary who engages in deliberate public humiliation of family members or uses private family information to cause emotional distress to other family members can trigger the acceleration clause. The trustee, that's you, has 90 days to make a determination about whether the behavior meets the threshold outlined in the document. And if I decide it does, then the lake house and its associated maintenance fund transfer immediately to the Veterans Rehabilitation Program that Martha specified. Tommy's inheritance from other family assets remains unchanged, but his claim to the lake house becomes null and void. I stared out the window at the snow-covered courthouse square, thinking about the summers Tommy and I had spent at the lake house when he was young, teaching him to fish from the dock, helping him build a treehouse in the big oak beside the water, watching him learn to operate the small motorboat with the careful concentration that came from understanding that some privileges required responsibility. "There's no cooling off period?" I asked. "No way to reverse the decision if he apologizes or shows genuine remorse?" Doug shook his head. Martha was adamant about that. She felt that allowing people to escape consequences through strategic apologies would undermine the entire purpose of the provision. She wanted protection for the family, not leverage for negotiation. I thought about Tommy's first question after watching his mother's video message, his immediate focus on legal challenges rather than emotional understanding. Martha had known her son well enough to predict that his initial response would be calculation rather than contrition. "There is one alternative provision," Doug continued, flipping to another section of the trust document. "If Tommy voluntarily agrees to a behavioral modification plan, essentially a written commitment to family harmony with specific measurable conditions, the acceleration can be postponed for 1 year while he demonstrates compliance." "What kind of conditions?" Martha outlined several possibilities: regular family participation without discussion of financial matters, completion of family counseling sessions, a written agreement not to disparage family members or discuss private family business with outsiders. The specific terms would be negotiated between you as trustee and Tommy as beneficiary. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of decisions that would affect generations of my family. Martha had given me the tools to protect everyone from Tommy's worst impulses, but using them would likely destroy whatever remained of our father-son relationship. "What would you do, Doug, if it were your son?" He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm I recognized from the decades of friendship. Doug had raised 3 children of his own, weathered his own crises of family loyalty and disappointed expectations. "I'd probably try the behavioral modification route first," he said finally. "Give him a chance to prove that last night was an aberration rather than a pattern. But I'd also make it clear that the alternative isn't negotiable. Martha trusted you to make these decisions because she knew you'd prioritize the family's well-being over your own feelings." After leaving Doug's office, I drove to the lake house, taking the winding county roads through snow-covered farmland and bare-branched woods. The trip usually took 90 minutes from town, but the plows hadn't reached the back roads yet, and I had to take my time navigating through the fresh snowfall. The lake house sat on a small rise overlooking the water, its cedar siding weathered to a soft gray that blended with the winter sky. Martha and I had bought it in 1988, the year after Tommy was born, using money we'd saved for a decade and a small inheritance from her grandmother. It wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to work in. But it had become the repository of our best memories as a family. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the familiar scent of cedar and lake water, and the faint ghost of thousands of summer meals cooked on the old gas stove. The living room was exactly as we'd left it in August. Martha's reading chair positioned to catch the morning light, the jigsaw puzzle she'd been working on still spread across the card table, half finished and waiting for hands that would never return to complete it. I walked through each room slowly, seeing it through Tommy's eyes. The outdated appliances that could be upgraded, the single bathroom that could be expanded, the screened porch that could be enclosed to extend the rental season. But I also saw it through Martha's eyes, the kitchen window where she'd stood every morning watching the sunrise over the water, the bedroom where we'd made love on countless summer nights with the windows open and the sound of gentle waves providing a natural soundtrack, the dock where we'd taught our children and grandchildren that patience and quiet observation were sometimes more valuable than constant activity. This place had saved our marriage in the years after Tommy's birth, providing neutral ground where we could remember why we'd chosen each other and rebuild the intimacy that had been damaged by separation and secrets. Every summer for 26 years, we'd spent 2 weeks here with no television, no work calls, no distractions beyond the rhythm of lake life. Tommy had taken his first steps on this dock, caught his first fish from these waters, learned to swim in the protected cove behind the house. But I also remembered the conversations we'd had here in recent years, Tommy's growing impatience with what he called rustic charm, and his suggestions about maximizing the property's potential. He'd never said it directly, but I could see him calculating square footage and rental rates while the rest of us were watching sunsets and playing card games on the screened porch. I spent 2 hours at the lake house, going through Martha's things, and making a list of personal items that should be distributed among family members before any legal changes took place. Her collection of vintage mysteries, carefully organized on the living room bookshelves, the handmade quilts she'd bought from local artisans over the years, the photo albums documenting decades of summer memories. When I finally locked up and headed back to town, I'd made my decision. I would offer Tommy the behavioral modification option, giving him 1 year to prove that Christmas night had been an emotional mistake rather than a calculated attack. But I would also begin the preliminary paperwork for the charitable donation, ensuring that Martha's wishes could be implemented quickly if he failed to meet the conditions. The drive home took me past the cemetery where Martha was buried, and I stopped to brush snow off her headstone and leave the small pine wreath I'd brought from the lake house. The granite was cold under my gloved hand, but somehow her presence felt closer here than it had anywhere else since her death. "I'm trying to do right by everyone," I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to a stone marker. "But I won't let him destroy what we built together. Not the lake house, not the family, not the memory of what love looks like when people choose each other every day." By the time I got home, it was late afternoon and the phone was ringing. Sarah's voice was tight with worry when I answered. "Dad, Tommy called me this morning. He's upset about something that happened last night, something about legal documents in the lake house. He won't tell me the details, but he asked me a lot of questions about what I remember from when he was born." I closed my eyes, realizing that Tommy was already beginning to test the boundaries, to seek allies and alternative perspectives on his situation. This was exactly the kind of behavior Martha had anticipated when she'd insisted on the non-disparagement clauses. "What did you tell him, sweetheart?" "The truth, that I was 14 and focused on my own problems, that I don't remember much about that time beyond being excited about having a baby brother. But Dad, he seemed really angry, not just upset, angry in a way that scared me." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the phone number Doug had given me for Dr. Patricia Wendell, a family counselor who specialized in inheritance disputes and multi-generational conflict resolution. If Tommy agreed to the behavioral modification plan, counseling sessions would be a mandatory component, a neutral space where we could try to rebuild trust and communication. But first, I needed to have a conversation with my son about choices and consequences, about the difference between being a victim of circumstances and taking responsibility for your own actions. I needed to find out whether the man who'd humiliated his family on Christmas night was the real Tommy, or whether some part of the boy I'd raised still existed underneath the anger and disappointment. I pulled out a legal pad and began drafting the letter that would formally present Tommy with his options. 12 months to demonstrate that family relationships mattered more than financial gain, or immediate activation of the charitable trust that would preserve the lake house as Martha had intended. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in the kind of fresh possibility that Martha had always loved. But inside my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of 40 years of family life, I was planning for a future that might not include my son at all. The weight of that possibility settled over me like a physical thing, heavy and cold and final. But I'd made promises to Martha about protecting the family she'd loved so fiercely, and some promises were too important to break, even when keeping them cost more than you thought you could afford to pay. The phone call came 3 days later, just as I was finishing my morning coffee and contemplating the letter I'd spent 2 days drafting and redrafting. Tommy's voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of the righteous anger that had carried him through Christmas dinner. "Dad," he said without preamble, "I've been thinking about what Mom said in the video, about choices and consequences. I think maybe we should talk, properly this time." I set down my coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the bird feeder Martha had insisted on placing, where she could see it from the breakfast table. A cardinal was perched on the edge, its red feathers brilliant against the white snow, one of the signs she'd always claimed meant she was still watching over us. "I'm listening," I said. "Not on the phone? At the lake house, maybe? This weekend?" I know it's January and the heat's been turned off, but he paused and I could hear him struggling with words. I think this conversation needs to happen in the place where it all started, where you and Mom decided to try again. The request surprised me. Tommy had never been sentimental about the lake house, had always treated it as a pleasant but impractical relic of his parents' romantic notions about simple living. That he would choose it as the venue for what might be our final conversation suggested he was taking this more seriously than I'd dared to hope. "I'll call Dr. Wendell," I said. "If we're going to do this, we should do it right, with someone trained to help families navigate this kind of crisis." "You already found a counselor?" I could hear the surprise in his voice, and perhaps something else. Relief, maybe, that I was taking his problem seriously enough to seek professional help. "Your mother's trust documents require mediation as part of any behavioral modification agreement. She wanted to make sure we had the tools to succeed if we chose to try." There was a long pause. "She really thought of everything, didn't she?" "She loved you enough to plan for your worst possible behavior," I said gently. "And she loved the rest of us enough to protect us from it." Dr. Patricia Wendell was a woman in her 60s with silver hair, and the kind of calm presence that came from 30 years of helping families navigate their most difficult conversations. She agreed to meet us at the lake house on Saturday afternoon, driving up from Grand Rapids in her sensible Subaru, with a briefcase full of forms and agreements that would structure our attempt at reconciliation. I arrived first, spending an hour getting the old furnace running and checking the pipes for freeze damage. The house felt different in winter, smaller and more intimate, the lake visible through bare trees that would be thick with leaves during our summer visits. I made coffee on the old gas stove and set out the folding chairs we'd need for our conversation, arranging them in a circle in the living room where Martha's unfinished jigsaw puzzle still waited on the card table. Tommy arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, punctual in the way that had served him well in business, but sometimes made family interactions feel like scheduled appointments. He'd brought Jessica with him, though she stayed in the car initially, reading a book and giving us space for what we all knew would be a difficult afternoon. Dr. Wendell established the ground rules quickly and efficiently. Each of us would have uninterrupted time to explain our perspective on the Christmas dinner incident and its aftermath. We would focus on specific behaviors rather than character judgments. We would work toward a written agreement that addressed both my concerns about family harmony and Tommy's need for clarity about his inheritance status. "Frank," she said, consulting her notes, "why don't you start by explaining what you experienced on Christmas night and what you need to see change moving forward?" I looked across the circle at my son, seeing him clearly in the afternoon light filtering through the lake house windows. His face was thinner than it had been at Christmas, his eyes shadowed with what looked like sleepless nights. The anger that had sustained him through his confrontation with family secrets had given way to something more complicated. Regret, maybe, or simple exhaustion. "Tommy humiliated his family in front of children," I said simply. "He turned Christmas dinner into a courtroom where he was prosecutor and judge, presenting evidence of old family pain as if it were a criminal case. He accused his mother and me of dishonesty and deception, and he did it in a way that frightened his 8-year-old daughter and made his sister cry." I paused, choosing my words carefully. But what hurt most wasn't the accusations or even the public nature of his attack. What hurt was seeing that he'd lost sight of what family means. That he'd reduced 36 years of love and support and daily presence to a genetic testing result and a timeline of events that happened before he was old enough to understand their context. Tommy was staring at his hands, his jaw tight with the effort of staying silent during my allotted time. "I need to know that he understands the difference between being hurt and being hurtful," I continued. "I need to know that he can be angry about learning difficult truths without punishing the people who protected him from those truths for 36 years. And I need to know that he values being part of this family more than he values being right about its imperfections." Dr. Wendell made notes on her legal pad, then turned to Tommy. "Your turn. Help us understand what you were feeling on Christmas night and what you need from this process." Tommy looked up, his eyes bright with emotion he was struggling to control. "I felt betrayed," he said quietly. "Not just about the paternity issue, but about being the only one who didn't know. About living my whole life inside a story that wasn't completely true." He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the lake, his back to us as he continued talking. I know Dad thinks this was about money, about the lake house and inheritance rights. And maybe part of it was. I'm not going to lie about that. But mostly it was about feeling like a fool, like everyone else was in on this secret and I was the only one who believed the fairy tale version of our family history. I wanted to interrupt, to explain that there had been no conspiracy of silence, no family secret that everyone else shared. But Dr. Wendell's rules required me to listen without defending, to try to understand Tommy's perspective even when it felt distorted or unfair. I spent months researching this, Tommy continued, turning back to face us, calling distant relatives I'd never met, following paper trails, trying to piece together the truth about 1987. And the more I learned, the angrier I got, not just about the affair, but about what felt like a massive cover-up designed to protect everyone except me. He sat back down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I know I handled Christmas dinner badly. I know I hurt people I love, and I'm sorry for that. But I still don't understand why I didn't have a right to know the truth about my own parentage. Dr. Wendell let the silence stretch for a moment, then looked at both of us. I think we're dealing with two different definitions of truth here. Tommy, you're focused on biological facts and historical events. Frank, you're focused on emotional realities and chosen relationships. Both are valid, but they're not the same thing. She pulled out a folder of documents from her briefcase. The behavioral modification agreement offers a way to bridge that gap. Tommy, it gives you a chance to demonstrate that you can integrate this new information about your biological origins without using it as a weapon against your family. Frank, it gives you assurance that Martha's wishes about family harmony will be respected. The agreement was 5 pages long, detailed and specific in the way that legal documents needed to be. Tommy would commit to 6 months of family counseling sessions with Dr. Wendell. He would agree not to discuss private family business with anyone outside the immediate family without prior consent from all parties involved. He would participate in regular family gatherings without raising issues related to inheritance or financial planning. Most importantly, he would sign a non-disparagement agreement promising not to use his knowledge of family history to hurt or embarrass other family members. In return, I would delay any action on the charitable trust acceleration for 12 months. The lake house would remain in family ownership during that period, giving Tommy time to prove that he could honor the values Martha had tried to instill in him. If he successfully completed the behavioral modification program, his inheritance rights would remain unchanged. If he failed to meet the conditions, the lake house would transfer to the Veterans Rehabilitation Program, as originally outlined in the trust documents. There's one additional component, Dr. Wendell said, pulling out another form. A family mission statement that you'll work together to create over the next several sessions. Something that defines what this family stands for, what values you want to preserve and pass on to the grandchildren. Tommy read through the agreement slowly, his lawyer's training evident in the way he examined each clause and condition. When he finished, he looked across the circle at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What happens if I can't do this?" he asked. "What happens if 6 months from now I'm still angry about being lied to for 36 years? Then you'll have chosen financial loss over family unity," I said simply. "And Martha's wishes about the lake house will be honored exactly as she intended." He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the frozen lake where we'd spent so many summers together. I could see him thinking, weighing costs and benefits in the methodical way that had made him successful in business. But I could also see something else, a flicker of the boy who used to sit on this same dock with a fishing pole and infinite patience, content to spend hours in comfortable silence as long as his dad was beside him. "I want to try," he said finally. "I want to believe that this family is worth fighting for, even when fighting means swallowing my pride and accepting that maybe I was wrong about some things." Dr. Wendell handed him a pen, and he signed the agreement with the same careful attention he'd given to reading it. When he passed the documents to me, his hand brushed mine briefly, the first physical contact we'd had since Christmas night that wasn't formal or distant. "There's something else," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket for the small wooden box I'd brought from home. "Your mother wanted you to have this, regardless of how this situation resolved itself. The box was made from the same cherry wood as Emma's jewelry box, but older and more worn. Martha had crafted it during our early years at the lake house, when she'd been learning woodworking techniques from a local craftsman who taught classes in the village hardware store. Tommy opened it carefully, revealing the contents Martha had chosen for him. A photo of the three of us from his first summer at the lake house, when he was 6 months old and still small enough to sleep in the portable crib we'd set up on the screened porch. In the picture, I was holding him while Martha pointed towards something in the water, probably a loon or a family of ducks that had caught her attention. Beneath the photo was a key, the original key to the lake house front door, cut from brass that had tarnished to a soft gold over the decades of use. "She said to give you this when you were ready to understand what the lake house really meant to our family," I said. "Not as an investment property or a financial asset, but as a place where we learned to choose each other every day, even when choosing was difficult." Tommy held the key up to the light, seeing the scratches and worn edges that came from 26 years of summer vacations and weekend retreats. When he looked back at me, his eyes were wet with tears he wasn't trying to hide. "I remember this day," he said, pointing to the photo. "Not specifically, obviously, but I remember the feeling of this place. The way it always felt different from home, calmer somehow, like time moved slower here. That's what your mother wanted to preserve," I said. "Not just the property, but the feeling. The sense that some places are sacred not because of what they're worth, but because of what they've witnessed." Dr. Wendell began packing up her materials, satisfied that we'd made more progress in 3 hours than many families managed in months of conventional therapy. The behavioral modification agreement would require follow-up sessions, regular check-ins to monitor Tommy's compliance with the conditions he'd accepted, but the foundation had been laid for something that might eventually become reconciliation. As we prepared to leave the lake house, Tommy walked out onto the dock where ice had formed along the shoreline, but the center of the lake remained open water. I followed him, our footsteps echoing on the weathered boards that would need replacing in another year or two. "Dad," he said without looking at me, "I need you to know that I never meant to hurt Emma or Michael. When I planned that whole confrontation, I was thinking about adults and adult conversations. I forgot that children don't distinguish between family drama and family safety." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd heard from him since Christmas night, and it addressed the part of his behavior that had hurt me most, his willingness to subject innocent children to adult pain and confusion. "The hardest part of being a parent," I said, "is learning that good intentions don't excuse harmful actions. You can love someone completely and still damage them if you're not careful about how you express that love." We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the winter light fade over water that would be thick with ice within a few weeks. This had been our ritual during summer visits, the evening walk to the end of the dock, the quiet moments of connection that didn't require words or explanations. "Do you think we can fix this?" Tommy asked. "Do you think there's a way back to being father and son instead of adversaries in a legal proceeding?" I thought about Martha's video message, about her faith that love was a choice that could be made again and again, even after betrayal and disappointment, and the kind of mistakes that seemed too large to forgive. "I think," I said carefully, "that we can try. One day at a time, one conversation at a time, until we remember what we meant to each other before DNA tests and inheritance documents got in the way." The drive back to town was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd committed to and what we were risking. The behavioral modification agreement was a beginning, not a resolution, a framework for rebuilding trust that had been damaged by secrets and assumptions and the different ways people could interpret the same set of facts. But it was a beginning, which was more than we'd had when the day started. And for the first time since Christmas dinner, I allowed myself to hope that Martha's faith in the power of chosen love might be stronger than the genetic determinism that had driven Tommy to his research and his accusations. The lake house key was in his pocket now, a tangible reminder that some inheritances were more valuable than money, and that the most important things families passed down to their children weren't assets but values, not property, but the knowledge that love was work worth doing even when the work was difficult. Whether Tommy would learn that lesson in time to save his place in the family remained to be seen. But for the first time in a week, I believed it was possible. 6 months later, on a warm June morning scented with fresh-cut grass, I stood in the lake house driveway, watching a ceremony Martha would have loved. The Veterans Rehab Program was formally accepting our family retreat. Not quite how Martha had imagined it, but meaningful all the same. Tommy stood beside me, his hand on Emma's shoulder as she read the dedication plaque. Her voice, clear and steady, reflected the reading lessons she once shared with Martha. The Martha Kowalski Memorial Retreat Center, established in loving memory of a woman who believed healing happens best in places where people choose to care for each other every day. The plaque would hang by the front door. Below Martha's name, another line: donated by the Kowalski Family Trust in honor of chosen love and second chances. The change hadn't unfolded as Martha's trust had scripted. Tommy had completed the behavioral agreement, attended all sessions with Dr. Wendell, and genuinely worked to rebuild our relationship. He upheld the non-disparagement clause, even when pressed by business partners for gossip. More importantly, he realized his desire for the lake house wasn't about profit. It was about control, about securing his place in the family after learning about his biological origins. When he understood that chosen bonds outweighed biology, he suggested the donation himself at a quiet family dinner in April. "I keep thinking about what Mom said in that video," he told us. "This place taught us patience, family, and how to sit quietly beside someone you love. Other families should get that too." The veterans group welcomed the gift. The house would host week-long workshops in woodworking, fishing, and healing for veterans with PTSD. Updates would be gradual: new kitchen, second bathroom, enclosed porch. But its heart would remain unchanged. Watching Emma finish reading the plaque as families listened quietly, I felt Martha's presence more strongly than ever. She'd have adored the blend of formality and warmth, kids and adults mingling under picnic tables, people discovering the peace she found here. "Grandpa Frank," Emma asked, tugging my sleeve, "do you think Grandma would like what we did with her house?" I lifted her, despite her protests that she was too big. "I think she'd be proud we chose love over money and family over fear." The ceremony lasted an hour, followed by tours and a potluck that reminded me of Martha's church events. Tommy served food, Jessica ran logistics, Sarah talked renovations with the directors. Michael, now 5, played tour guide, telling anyone who'd listen about the secret dock compartment where I kept fishing line. That evening, after the crowd had gone, I sat on the dock with Dr. Wendell, who had come at Tommy's invitation. She'd become more than a counselor. She'd helped us navigate through broken trust. "How are you feeling about all this?" she asked, settling into a chair. I watched a loon family dive beyond the dock. Martha always said loons meant the lake was healthy. "Peaceful," I said. "For the first time since Martha died, I feel like I'm honoring her instead of just surviving her absence." "And Tommy?" she asked. I glanced toward the house. Tommy was loading chairs into his SUV with his usual quiet focus. He wasn't the angry man from Christmas night anymore. He was someone who'd faced painful truths and grown stronger because of them. "He's different," I said, "not just because of the truth about his birth, but because he's figured out that love isn't entitlement, and that families take maintenance, just like everything else that matters." From the driveway came car doors and Emma's laughter. Tommy gave her careful instructions about her new jewelry box, a birthday gift he'd commissioned, made from walnut, not cherry, an elaborate secret compartment, even trickier to open. "Dad," he called, walking over, "we're heading back. Emma's got a sleepover, and Jessica wants to hit the farmer's market." I met him halfway across the lawn. He looked so much like Martha when he smiled. "Thank you," he said, offering his hand, "for letting me get this right, for not giving up when I gave you every reason to." The handshake became an embrace. I saw tears in his eyes. "Your mother believed love was a daily choice," I said. "Today, I'm choosing pride in the man you've become, not disappointment in your mistakes." After they left, Dr. Wendell and I sat on the dock as the sun dipped low. The past 6 months had brought real healing, not just from therapy compliance, but from Tommy's willingness to reflect and change. "The best family interventions," she said, "don't punish the past. They give people tools to choose differently going forward." Martha built that into the trust. As the lake turned orange and pink like one of Martha's watercolors, I thought of the year since she died. The grief remained, but now it lived beside something steadier: completion, promises kept, a family intact, not perfect, but resilient. The lake house would continue to heal, just like Martha wanted. Her grandchildren would grow up knowing love is a decision, not an accident. That family isn't just inherited, it's built through kindness and commitment. I drove home in the warm summer air, windows down. The house would be quiet, as it had been for 18 months, but not lonely. It felt like peace. In the garage, her socket set was whole again. I'd found the missing 9s16 and returned it to its place. Her tools were ready for the next project. On my workbench was that next project, a memory box for Michael, oak wood, hidden compartments. Inside one, I'd placed the letter Martha had written him about kindness, curiosity, and choosing love, even when it's hard. The garage smelled of sawdust, WD-40, and her faint vanilla perfume, scents that would linger long after I was gone. I turned on the radio and picked up the sandpaper, falling into the rhythm that had carried me through every crisis, every joy. Outside, snow began to fall again, early flurries for another Wisconsin winter. Inside, the work continued, surrounded by everything Martha and I had built. Michael's box was nearly done, its hidden space ready for secrets and treasures. Next week I'd give it to him, just like I'd given Emma hers, carefully, quietly, with the reverence these gifts deserved. Because that's what grandfathers do. Build things that last, tell stories that matter, and show, through patient work, that love is a craft, not a speech. The radio played Silent Night, though Christmas was far off. But some songs, like Love, ignore the calendar. They return when we need them most. I sanded with the grain, always with the grain, feeling imperfections vanish under my fingertips. My mind wandered to Lake House summers, Martha's table, and all the moments that had shaped our lives. The work was meditation, a prayer, a promise to the future, grounded in the past. In Michael's secret compartment, her letter waited for him, just as Emma's had before, words not of inheritance, but of wisdom, not of wealth, but of legacy. The snow thickened outside, blanketing the world in fresh possibility, just as Martha always said it would. And inside, I kept working, quietly, carefully, building something beautiful for the next generation to discover, to treasure, and, someday, to pass on. Because that's what love looks like when shaped by hand. Not flashy, but faithful. Not loud, but lasting. It looks like a grandfather sanding wood while Christmas music plays in June, crafting a gift that will outlive him. The work went on, the love endured, and the snow fell softly, as if blessing a world rebuilt by choice.